Cecil Ferris told me something in the spring of 1997 that I have carried with me every day since. We were sitting on a downed log above the Trinity River, about 4 miles upstream from the Hupa Valley, watching the afternoon light move through the Douglas fir canopy, the way it does in that part of Northern California, slow and golden and heavy with pollen. Cecil was 67 years old. I was 50. We had known each other for 15 years at that point, worked together on dozens of boundary surveys, shared hundreds of meals, and spent more hours in silence together than most married couples manage in a lifetime. He trusted me enough by then to say things he did not say to outsiders, and what he said that afternoon on the log above the river was this. He said the Omaha do not hide from people. He said they choose who gets to see them. And then he looked at me with those dark, steady eyes and said that the reason most white people never see one is not because they are rare or because they are shy or because they live too far from roads. The reason, he said, is that most white people are too loud inside their own heads, and the Omaha can hear that noise the same way you or I can hear a chainsaw from 2 ridges away. He said they stay invisible to the loud ones, but to the quiet ones, the ones who have been broken open by grief or loneliness or years of sitting still in the woods, they show themselves freely. Sometimes, he said, they even come close. I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. It took me another 11 years to understand it, and the understanding did not come through thinking. It came through seeing, through being chosen myself. But that story comes later, and if I told it first, you would not believe it, because you would not have the context that makes it possible to believe. So I need to start at the beginning, which for me was the summer of 1972 when I was 25 years old, and the Bureau of Land Management sent me to the most remote piece of country I had ever seen in my life. My name is Clifford Nix. I am 78 years old. I was born in Redding, California in 1947, the son of a lumber grader at a sawmill on the Sacramento River and a woman who ran the office at a Chevrolet dealership on Market Street. I grew up in the heat of the Central Valley, which is flat and dry and about as far from the coastal mountains as you can get while still being in Northern California. I studied surveying at Shasta College, got my certification in 1969, and spent 3 years doing road surveys for Caltrans in the Redding district before the BLM offered me a position in their Arcata field office, which covered the public lands adjacent to and sometimes overlapping with the 6 Rivers National Forest. I took the job because it paid $1,100 a month, which was more than Caltrans, and because the job description said field work in remote terrain, and I was 25 and wanted to see country that didn't look like the Sacramento Valley. I was not prepared for what I found. The 6 Rivers country is a different world from the valley. It is a landscape of deep canyons and knife-edge ridges and river gorges so steep that sunlight only reaches the water for a few hours a day. The forests are old, not the managed second growth you see along the highways, but actual old growth, Douglas fir and tannock and madrone, some of the firs 6 and 7 feet through at the base, trees that were already centuries old when the Spanish missions were being built along the coast. The rivers are cold and green and fast, and in 1972 the roads into the backcountry were logging roads, single-lane dirt tracks that turned to mud soup in the rainy season and dust clouds in the summer, and some of them hadn't been maintained since the timber companies pulled out in the late 60s. My job was to survey BLM parcels, which meant hiking into country that sometimes hadn't seen a human footprint in years, setting up my transit and chain, running lines through brush so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction, and camping alone for days at a time in places where the nearest telephone was a 20-mile drive. I loved it. The solitude suited me in a way I hadn't expected. I had always been a quiet person, the kind of kid who would rather read a book in the truck while his father fished, then cast a line himself. The kind of young man who went to movies alone and ate lunch at his desk. I wasn't antisocial. I just didn't need constant conversation the way some people do, and the Six Rivers backcountry rewarded that temperament. The quieter I was, the more the forest showed me. Deer that would have bolted from a louder man would stand and watch me work from 30 yards. I saw a fisher cat in a tannock tree, which my supervisor said was almost unheard of. I saw a ringtail on a creek bank at dusk, grooming itself like a house cat, unconcerned by my presence. The forest seemed to accept me, which sounds like something a person says when they want to sound mystical, but I mean it in a practical sense. I wasn't a threat. The animals could tell, so they let me stay. The first thing I ever found that I couldn't explain was in August of 1973, about 14 months into my time in the Six Rivers. I was surveying a BLM parcel on a ridgeline above Mill Creek, about 8 miles east of the town of Hupa. The parcel bordered both Forest Service land and the Hupa Valley Indian Reservation, which meant the survey had legal implications for all 3 jurisdictions. And I was being careful. I had been camped on that ridge for 3 days, working alone, running lines through dense brush and across rocky outcrops. On the 3rd afternoon, I was cutting through a stand of young tannock when I came into a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, and found a structure. It was made of branches, large branches, some of them 3 and 4 inches in diameter, stripped of their bark and woven together in a pattern that was too regular to be a natural fall. The structure was roughly conical, maybe 7 feet tall at its peak, with an opening on one side that faced downhill toward the creek. Inside the opening, the ground had been cleared of debris and covered with a layer of fern fronds, dried but still green at the tips, which meant they had been placed recently. There was a smell inside the structure, not unpleasant but strong, like wet soil mixed with musk and animal, a smell that reminded me of the bear exhibit at the Sacramento Zoo when I was a child, but different, earthier, more complex. I had never encountered that particular smell before, and I have never forgotten it. I stood in front of that structure for a long time, trying to make it make sense. It wasn't a hunter's blind. Hunters in that country used tree stands or ground blinds made of camo netting, not stripped branches woven into a cone. It wasn't a campsite. There was no fire ring, no trash, no sign of human habitation. It was too large and too well constructed to be an animal den. A bear wouldn't strip bark from branches. A bear wouldn't weave anything. I took measurements because that was my training. The branches had been broken from living trees, not deadfall, and the breakpoints were high, 8 and 9 feet off the ground, which meant whatever broke them was either very tall or had a very long reach. Some of the branches showed what looked like twist marks at the breakpoint, as if they had been gripped and torqued until they separated from the trunk. I had worked around loggers for years. I knew what a branch looked like when it was cut with a saw, or snapped by wind, or broken by the weight of snow. These branches had been broken by hands, large hands with enormous grip strength, twisting green wood until it surrendered. I wrote it up in my field notes as an unidentified structure, which was the blandest possible language I could find, and I moved on with my survey. But I didn't forget it, and over the next 2 years, working that same general area, I found 4 more. Same construction method, same size, same smell. Always in remote drainages, always near water, always with that opening facing downhill. I mentioned the structures to my supervisor in Arcata, a man named Warren Bell, and he nodded and said that sort of thing turns up from time to time in the Six Rivers. The Forest Service had a file on them. The Hupa had a name for whatever made them, but he couldn't remember what it was. He told me not to put too much in the official report because it complicated the paperwork. That was all he said about it. I got the impression it was a subject he had decided long ago not to pursue, the way a man decides not to open a closet door because he doesn't want to know what's behind it. In the fall of 1974, I heard the sound for the first time. I was camped on a bench above the South Fork of the Trinity, running a survey that had me in the field for 6 days. It was my 4th night out. The weather had been clear and cool, mid-October, and the river was running low after the summer dry season. I had finished my dinner, canned stew heated on a propane burner, and was sitting in my camp chair reviewing my notes by headlamp when something vocalized from the ridgeline above me. I say vocalized because the word scream doesn't capture it, and the word call doesn't either. It was a sound that started in a low register, rose through what felt like 2 octaves, held at the top for maybe 3 seconds, and then descended in a series of staccato pulses that were almost rhythmic, almost musical. It lasted maybe 8 seconds total, and it was the loudest organic sound I had ever heard. Louder than an elk bugle, louder than a cougar scream. It came from maybe 300 yards above me, somewhere in the timber on the north-facing slope, and it echoed off the canyon walls and came back to me from 3 directions. I sat absolutely still. My headlamp was the only light in that canyon. The river was behind me, barely a whisper at that water level. The forest around me had gone dead silent, which told me something, because October nights in the Trinity drainage are full of sound, owls and coyotes, and the rustle of nocturnal rodents. Everything had stopped. Everything was listening. The sound came again. Same source, same direction, same impossible volume and tonal range. But this time, it was followed by a response. A second vocalization, similar in structure but different in pitch, came from somewhere across the canyon, maybe half a mile away on the south-facing slope. The 2 sources traded calls 3 more times, the cadence quickening slightly each round, as if they were having a conversation. Then both went silent, and after maybe 2 minutes, the normal night sound slowly resumed, the way an orchestra tunes up after the conductor leaves the podium, 1 instrument at a time. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, exactly, but because I was listening. I sat in my chair until dawn, my headlamp off, my propane burner cold, dead still, waiting for the sound to come again. It didn't. But in those hours of sitting in the dark, a shift happened that I didn't recognize until years later. I stopped being loud inside my own head. All the mental noise, the survey calculations, the grocery list, the argument I'd had with my girlfriend the previous week, the carburetor problem on my truck, all of it drained away, and what was left was just the forest and me in it, and the knowledge that I was not alone in that canyon, and that whatever else was there was aware of me the same way I was aware of it. Not threatening, not friendly exactly, just aware, present, watching to see what I would do. What I did was nothing. I sat still and listened and breathed and let the night pass. And by dawn I had the peculiar feeling that I had passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking. I met Cecil Ferris in the spring of 1982. I had been working the 6 Rivers District for 10 years by then, and my survey work frequently required coordination with the Hupa Tribal Forestry Department because BLM parcels adjoined reservation boundaries. The Tribal Forestry Office was in Hupa, a small town on the Trinity River that serves as the capital of the Hupa Valley Indian Reservation. The reservation itself covers about 144 square miles of mountainous forest, 12 miles square, with the Trinity River running through its center. The Hupa, or more properly the Hupa, had been there for thousands of years, long before the reservation boundaries were drawn, long before the 6 Rivers National Forest was carved out of the surrounding mountains in 1947, long before any European had ever set foot in that drainage. Cecil was a timber management officer for the tribe, which meant he was responsible for marking trees for selective harvest, monitoring road construction, and ensuring that the tribe's logging operations, which were its primary source of revenue, didn't damage the salmon-bearing streams that were the other pillar of Hupa life. He was 52 when I met him, a lean man with silver-streaked black hair that he wore pulled back in a ponytail, deep lines in his face from decades of sun and wind, and a stillness about him that I recognized immediately because it was the same stillness I had been cultivating in myself for a decade. He didn't fidget. He didn't fill silence with talk. When he spoke, every word had been considered beforehand, and none of them were wasted. Our first meeting was professional. I needed his sign-off on a boundary verification near Tishtang Creek, and we spent an afternoon walking the line together, comparing my survey data against the tribal records. He was precise and thorough and knew the country better than my maps did. He corrected 2 of my reference points using landmarks that didn't appear on any topographic sheet because they were Hupa landmarks, a specific rock formation the tribe called something in their language that I couldn't pronounce, a particular bend in the creek where a ceremony had been held annually for longer than anyone could remember. I realized that day that the land I had been surveying with instruments for a decade was a place Cecil carried inside him the way I carried my own childhood house. Every room memorized, every crack in the foundation familiar. We became friends slowly. That is how both of us did things. Over the next several years, we worked together regularly, and the professional relationship gradually expanded to include shared lunches, shared truck rides to remote sites, and eventually shared evenings at his house in Hupa, where his wife, a woman named Bernice, would make salmon and acorn soup, and I would bring a bottle of something from the liquor store in Willow Creek, and we would sit on his porch and watch the light go red over the Trinity Alps to the east. It was on one of those porch evenings, maybe 2 years into our friendship, that Cecil first mentioned the Omaha. We had been talking about a logging road the tribe was planning to extend into the upper Mill Creek drainage, and I mentioned that I had found several of those branch structures up there during my surveys, and I asked him if he knew what made them. He went quiet for a long time. Bernice, who had been sitting in the kitchen doorway, got up and went inside without a word. Cecil finished his drink, set the glass on the porch rail, and said that the Hupa people knew exactly what made those structures. His grandfather had known, and his grandfather's grandfather had known, and the knowledge went back further than memory could reach. The Omaha had been in those mountains since before the Hupa arrived, and the Hupa had been there for a very long time. They were not animals, they were a kind of people. Not human people, but people. And what he was about to tell me was not something the tribe discussed with outsiders, and he was telling me only because I had been in the forest long enough to have earned it. I listened. I did not interrupt. This was the single most important thing I had learned in a decade of friendship with Cecil Ferris, that when a Hupa elder decides to share knowledge, you do not ask questions. You do not rush. You do not nod eagerly or lean forward or say, "Tell me more." You sit still and you receive what is given, and the quality of your silence determines whether more will follow. Cecil told me that the Hupa had a relationship with the Omaha that went back generations beyond counting. It was not a casual awareness. It was a managed relationship with protocols and obligations on both sides, maintained by specific families within the tribe who served as intermediaries. His family, the Ferris family, was one of those. Cecil's grandfather, a man named Franklin Ferris, had been what Cecil called a keeper, which was a person designated by the tribal council to monitor the Omaha population, maintain the traditional exchange points where food and materials were left for them, and ensure that the boundary between the human world and the Omaha world was respected. Cecil's father, Leonard, had served the same role. Cecil himself had carried it since Leonard's death in 1971. I asked him what a keeper actually did. He smiled, the small, patient smile of a man who has been asked a question that would take a week to answer properly, and said that on a practical level, it meant walking certain routes through the forest at certain times of year, leaving dried salmon and acorn meal at specific locations, and reading the signs that the Omaha left in return: broken branches arranged in patterns, stones placed in formations, vocalizations at particular times of night. These signs communicated territory boundaries, population changes, births and deaths, and sometimes warnings about human activity that was encroaching too far into their territory. The keeper's job was to interpret these signs and relay them to the tribal council, which used the information to guide its land management decisions: where the tribe logged, where it didn't, where roads were built, where they were abandoned, which creeks were left undisturbed, which ridgelines were not crossed. The entire geography of the Hupa Valley Reservation, Cecil told me, had been shaped in part by the presence of the Omaha. Not by their mythology, by their actual physical, ongoing presence. I sat on that porch and listened and felt the ground shift under me. That shift you get when you realize that a thing you dismissed as folklore is, in fact, someone else's science. The Hupa hadn't been telling stories. They had been conducting a centuries-long relationship management program with a species that Western biology refused to acknowledge existed. The branch structures I had been documenting for a decade were not mysteries. They were communication, and I had been walking through one side of a conversation without knowing the language. Cecil did not tell me everything that night. He told me a little, and then he stopped, and we sat in silence for a long time, and then Bernice brought out more coffee and the conversation moved to other things. This was how Cecil taught. He gave you a piece, and then he waited to see what you did with it. If you asked too many questions, he withdrew. If you sat with it, turned it over in your mind, and came back days or weeks later with a thoughtful observation rather than an eager demand, he gave you another piece. It was the opposite of how knowledge is transmitted in the world I came from, where information is extracted and consumed as quickly as possible. In Cecil's world, knowledge had to be earned through patience, and the earning was as important as the knowledge itself. Over the next several years, Cecil taught me, not in lectures or lessons, but in walks through the forest, in quiet meals on his porch, in offhand comments during workdays that I would realize later were carefully placed seeds. He taught me to recognize the signs. Not just the structures, but the ground disturbances, the bark stripped from trees at heights no bear could reach, the subtle alteration of creek banks where stones had been moved to redirect water flow. He taught me to read the vocalizations, not to translate them word for word, because he said even the keepers didn't fully understand the language, but to recognize the general categories. A long rising call meant territorial announcement. A series of short barks meant alarm. A low, rumbling hum that was more felt than heard meant contentment, usually associated with feeding or family group interaction. A scream, high and piercing and deeply unsettling, meant warning. That last one, he said, was the one you hoped to never hear directed at you. And he taught me about the choosing. This was the core of what Cecil knew, the central insight that had been passed down through the Ferris family for generations. And it was this: the Omaha were not hiding from human beings. They were making deliberate decisions about which human beings to reveal themselves to. They were, in Cecil's words, reading us the way we read books, and they only opened the door for people whose pages said something they recognized. I asked him what they recognized. What quality or trait or state of being made a person visible to the Omaha when most people were invisible? He said it wasn't a single thing, it was a combination. But the common thread across every account, the keepers had accumulated over centuries was quietness. Not physical quietness, though that helped. Internal quietness. A person who had stopped performing, stopped worrying about what they were supposed to be doing or thinking or feeling. A person who was simply present in the forest the way the trees were present, the way the water was present, the way the deer and the fox and the owl were present, without agenda, without noise. He said modern people were almost all disqualified by the volume of their own internal chatter, and that the Omaha could sense that chatter, the way they could sense a footstep on dry leaves, through some channel of perception that human science had not identified and probably would not identify because it operated outside the range of instruments. He said there were exceptions. People who were broken open by grief sometimes became visible. People in extreme physical need, lost, injured, hypothermic, children who had not yet learned to generate the constant internal noise that adults carry, and occasionally, rarely, a person who had spent so many years in real solitude that the noise had simply worn away, the way a river wears a stone smooth. He looked at me when he said that last one, and I understood that he was telling me something about myself. I married Pearl Coleman in 1978. She was from Weaverville, a town about 50 miles east of Hupa, and she worked as a bookkeeper for a logging company. She was a small, practical woman with red hair that she kept short because she said long hair was a vanity she didn't have time for, and she tolerated my long absences in the field with a patience that I sometimes felt I didn't deserve. We bought a house outside Willow Creek, a town of about 2,000 people that sits at the junction of Highway 299 and the road that runs north to Hupa. Willow Creek is famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, as the self-proclaimed Bigfoot capital of the world. There are Bigfoot statues on the main street. There is a Bigfoot museum. There are bumper stickers and t-shirts and coffee mugs in every gas station and gift shop. Pearl thought it was charming in an embarrassing sort of way. I thought it was a strange kind of camouflage, the truth hiding in plain sight behind gift shop kitsch, the reality of the Omaha buried under layers of commercial absurdity so thick that no serious person would bother to dig through them. Pearl knew about my interest in the Omaha. I told her about the structures, the vocalizations, the things Cecil was teaching me. She listened with affectionate pragmatism that neither encouraged nor discouraged. She believed me in the sense that she believed I was telling the truth about what I had experienced. Whether she believed that Bigfoot actually existed as a living species in the mountains surrounding our home, I am not sure she ever fully decided. She was a bookkeeper. She dealt in numbers that balanced. The Omaha did not balance. They existed in a column she didn't have a heading for, and so she filed them under things Clifford cares about and left it at that. Cecil began telling me about specific people in the fall of 1991. We were driving back from a survey site on the upper reaches of Supply Creek, a tributary of the Trinity that runs through some of the densest forest on the reservation. The drive out was long and slow on a logging road that switchbacked down through the canyon, and Cecil was in a talkative mood, which for him meant he spoke in complete paragraphs instead of single sentences. He asked me if I had ever wondered why some people had encounters and most people didn't. I said I had. He said the keepers had been tracking encounters for a long time, and that the pattern was consistent across generations. He said he was going to tell me about some of them, and that I should understand these were real people, not legends, and that some of them were still alive. The first person he told me about was a woman named Bonnie Falk. Cecil said Bonnie had been married to a man named Jerry Falk, who worked for a logging outfit that operated on the Trinity River drainage in the early 1970s. In the winter of 1976, Jerry was killed when a spar tree broke during a yarding operation and the main line whipped back and struck him. He was 34, Bonnie was 31, and she was left with 2 children under 5 and a house payment on a place about 9 miles up a dirt road from the town of Burnt Ranch. Cecil said Bonnie did not handle her husband's death the way people expected. She did not sell the house and move closer to family. She did not take the children and go to her mother's place in Redding. She stayed. She told people she stayed because the house was paid for, or nearly, and because Jerry had loved that piece of land and she wasn't going to let it go. But Cecil believed the real reason was that Bonnie had gone somewhere inside herself that she couldn't come back from, a place of grief so total that the normal world had become intolerable, and the only environment that matched what she felt inside was the forest. The trees didn't expect her to be brave. The river didn't ask her how she was doing. The mountains didn't tell her it was time to move on. They just existed, indifferent and permanent, and that indifference was the only comfort she could stand. 3 months after Jerry's death, in February of 1977, Bonnie was splitting firewood behind her house at dusk. The children were inside. The snow was about a foot deep, and the temperature was dropping toward freezing. She had the splitting maul raised over her head when she saw something standing at the tree line, about 60 yards from where she stood. She described it to Cecil as a figure, upright, massive, covered in dark hair that was the color of wet cedar bark. It was watching her, not threatening, not approaching, just standing at the boundary between the cleared ground around her house and the forest, and watching her work. Bonnie said she put the maul down and stood there and looked at it, and it looked at her, and neither of them moved for what she estimated was 2 or 3 minutes. She said she was not afraid. She said the absence of fear surprised her, more than the thing itself, because she had been afraid of everything since Jerry died. Afraid of the furnace and the truck and the telephone and the dark, and here was the most impossible thing she had ever seen, and she felt nothing but a strange, awful calm. She said the figure tilted its head slightly, the way a dog does when it hears a sound it can't identify, and then it turned and walked back into the trees with a stride that covered the snow without seeming to sink into it much, and then it was gone. She saw it 4 more times that winter, always at dusk, always at the tree line, always watching. On the 4th occasion in late March, it was closer, maybe 40 yards, and she could see details. The hands, which were enormous, dark-skinned, with fingers that looked longer than human fingers. The face, which she said was flat and broad, and more human than she expected, with deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge. The chest, which was massive, wider than any man she had ever seen, covered in that same dark reddish hair. She said it stood at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8, and that it smelled like forest floor after rain, loam and bark and mushroom, and a warmth underneath, alive. Cecil told me that Bonnie never reported any of this. She told Cecil because Cecil came to her house in the spring of '77 to check on a property line that ran between her land and the reservation, and he saw the tracks in the mud behind her woodpile. Tracks that were 18 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball, with a stride length that measured over 4 feet. He asked Bonnie about them, and she told him everything, and then she asked him what it was, and Cecil told her. He said Bonnie cried when he told her, not from fear, from the realization that the thing in the trees had been real, that she hadn't imagined it, that in the worst months of her life, a being she had no framework for understanding had come to the edge of her grief and stood there night after night, as if to say, I see you. I see that you are suffering. I am here. Cecil said the Omaha had chosen Bonnie because her grief had made her quiet. The constant internal noise that most people carry, the planning and worrying and narrating, had been burned out of her by loss, and what was left was a raw, open presence that the Omaha could read as clearly as Cecil could read a sign on a tree. He said grief was one of the most common doorways. Loss strips a person down to bare bone, to a place before words, and in that stripped-down state, the barrier between the human world and the Omaha world becomes thin enough to see through. I asked him if the Omaha ever came back to Bonnie after that spring. He said they did. He said Bonnie lived on that property until 1994, when she finally moved to Redding to be closer to her grown children, and that during those 17 years, she saw the Omaha regularly, not every day, not even every month, but enough that she came to think of their presence as a constant, like the river or the wind. She said it was always the same individual, which she knew because of a distinctive scar on its left forearm, and she said that over the years, she developed an understanding with it that she couldn't articulate and didn't try to. It came, it watched, she acknowledged it, and that was enough for both of them. Cecil said when Bonnie left the property, the Omaha left too. The new owners never saw a thing. The second story Cecil told me was about a boy named Ricky Kern. In July of 1983, Ricky was 6 years old. His family was camping at a site along Dillon Creek in the Klamath National Forest, about 20 miles north of the Hupa reservation. The family had driven up from Eureka for a long weekend, and Ricky wandered away from the campsite on the afternoon of the second day while his parents were fishing. By the time they realized he was gone, he had been missing for nearly 2 hours. Search and rescue was called. 40 volunteers plus a tracking dog worked the area for the rest of that day and through the night. The terrain was brutal, steep ravines choked with brush, creek drainages that could swallow a grown man, and a 6-year-old in sneakers and a t-shirt had no business being in any of it. The temperature dropped to the low 40s that night. Ricky had no jacket, no food, no water. The search coordinator told the parents privately that if the boy wasn't found by morning, the odds shifted significantly against a live recovery. They found Ricky on the morning of the third day. A tracker named Gene Pickett, who had been working a ridge above the drainage where the boy was last seen, followed a set of footprints in a muddy seep that didn't match any of the search team's boot prints. They were bare footprints. They were 17 inches long. They led down the ridge, across a creek, and up a brushy slope to a shallow cave formed by an overhang of sandstone. Ricky was inside the cave, asleep, curled up in a nest of fern fronds and moss that had clearly been gathered and arranged around him. His skin was warm. His color was good. He was, by every medical assessment performed at the scene and later at the hospital in Eureka, in perfect health. 3 days in the wilderness with no food, no water, and temperatures in the 40s. And the boy was warm, hydrated, and calm. Ricky told the search team that a big man had found him. He said the big man was very tall and had fur and smelled like dirt and didn't talk, but made sounds that Ricky understood. He said the big man carried him to the cave and brought him water in his hands, and brought him berries and sat outside the cave opening all night while Ricky slept. He said the big man's hands were warm, warmer than any person's hands Ricky had ever touched, and that when the big man put those hands around him, Ricky stopped being cold immediately. The search coordinator wrote it up as exposure-induced confusion. The parents were told their son had likely hallucinated due to mild hypothermia. The bare footprints in the mud were attributed to a local hiker, though no local hiker was ever identified or interviewed. The fern nest in the cave was attributed to Ricky himself, a survival instinct, though no one explained how a 6-year-old in sneakers had gathered enough material to insulate a sleeping area in complete darkness. The story made the local paper in Eureka and was forgotten within a week. Cecil knew about it because Gene Pickett, the tracker, was a Hupa tribal member, and Gene had made plaster casts of those 17-inch footprints and brought them to Cecil that same week. Cecil compared them to the record the keepers maintained and identified them as consistent with a mature male Omaha whose territory included the upper Dillon Creek drainage. He said the keepers had been tracking that individual for over a decade. Cecil said the Omaha had chosen Ricky because Ricky was a child, and children are inherently quiet in the way Cecil meant the word. A 6-year-old lost in the woods is not generating the kind of mental noise that adults produce. A 6-year-old is experiencing the moment purely, without analysis or narrative or strategy. A 6-year-old who is lost and cold and frightened is broadcasting a distress signal that is raw emotion, pure honesty, and completely legible to a being that reads emotional states the way a tracker reads footprints. The Omaha had not stumbled upon Ricky by accident. It had heard him. Not with its ears, though it might have heard his crying from a considerable distance. It had heard him with whatever faculty it used to assess the internal state of the beings that moved through its territory. And what it heard was a small, helpless, open thing that needed protection. So it provided protection, because that is what the Omaha do when they encounter real need. They respond to it. I asked Cecil if the Omaha had ever harmed anyone. He was quiet for a long time, longer than usual, and when he spoke, he chose his words with particular care. He said that in the full record of the keepers, spanning more generations than he could count, there was no account of an Omaha harming a human being who had not first threatened them or their young. There were accounts of the Omaha driving people away from certain areas, using intimidation, vocalizations, thrown rocks and branches, displays of size and strength that were meant to frighten without injuring. But actual harm, actual violence against a human, was not in the record. The keepers believed this was because the Omaha understood, at a bone-deep level, that humans and the Omaha were related. Not in the way that modern genetics might describe it, though Cecil acknowledged that the biological relationship was probably real. Related in a deeper sense. Sharing the same forests, the same rivers, the same air, the same ancient entanglement of species that had lived alongside each other for so long that the boundary between them was more a matter of convention than biology. He said the Omaha's reluctance to harm humans was not softness. It was recognition. The same way you might restrain yourself from striking a cousin you were angry with, even if that cousin had wronged you, because the blood between you was thicker than the grievance. He said the Omaha saw us as family. Distant family, difficult family, family that had largely forgotten the relationship and had become dangerous in its forgetting, but family nonetheless. The third person Cecil told me about was a man named Lyle Odom. Lyle was a Vietnam veteran who came home from his second tour in 1970 with a set of problems that the Veterans Administration in 1970 had no vocabulary for and no real interest in treating. He had been a door gunner on a Huey in the Ia Drang Valley, and what he saw there and what he did there left him with a version of himself that couldn't sit in a room with other people without calculating the exits. He couldn't hold a job. He couldn't sleep through a night without waking up swinging. He couldn't be touched without flinching. His marriage lasted 3 years after he came home, and when it ended, his wife took their daughter to Portland, and Lyle bought 40 acres of forest service in holding on the north slope of the Trinity Alps, near the headwaters of Canyon Creek, and he went into the woods, and he stayed there. Cecil met Lyle in 1984, about 11 years into Lyle's self-imposed exile. The tribal forestry crew was running a fire line survey along the boundary between the reservation and the Forest Service land where Lyle lived, and Cecil stumbled onto Lyle's camp, which was less a camp than a permanent installation. A hand-built cabin of peeled logs, a root cellar, a smokehouse, a garden that had been cleared from the forest floor by hand over the course of years. Lyle was living off the grid and off the land, growing potatoes and beans, smoking venison and salmon, gathering berries and acorns the way the Hupa had done for centuries. He had no electricity, no running water, no road access. He walked 8 miles to the nearest trailhead and another 12 to the nearest pavement. When he needed supplies, he couldn't produce himself, which was rarely. Cecil said that when he walked into Lyle's clearing, Lyle was sitting on a stump, sharpening a knife, and the first thing Cecil noticed was that Lyle was calm, not the brittle, watchful calm of a man who is performing control. The actual calm of a man who has, through some process of erosion, been reduced to his essential self. More than a decade alone in the woods had done to Lyle what grief had done to Bonnie Falk. It had stripped away everything that was not necessary. The noise was gone. The performance was gone. What remained was a man who existed in the forest, the way a rock exists in a stream, fully present, fully integrated, offering no resistance to the current. They talked for an hour. Lyle was not unfriendly, just unused to conversation, and his sentences came out in short bursts separated by long pauses, as if he had to retrieve each word from storage. Cecil asked him how he managed the winters, which could be brutal at that elevation, and Lyle said something that stopped Cecil cold. Lyle said he wasn't alone up there. Cecil asked him what he meant, and Lyle said there was something living in the timber above his cabin. He had been aware of it since his 2nd or 3rd year on the property. At first it was just sounds, the same vocalizations I had heard on the Trinity, the long rising calls that echoed off the canyon walls. Then it was tracks around his garden, big tracks, barefoot, appearing after rain and disappearing into the undergrowth. Then it was the structures, the woven branch formations that I had been documenting since 1973. And then, in the winter of 1980, it started leaving food. Lyle said he woke one morning to find a freshly killed rabbit on his doorstep. He thought a bobcat had left it, which didn't make sense but was the only explanation he could generate. A week later, a string of trout, gutted and cleaned, laid on a flat rock near his root cellar. Then a pile of acorns, shelled and sorted, in a bark container that looked like it had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. The gifts came regularly after that, every week or two, always food, always left in the same spot, always overnight. In the spring of 1981, Lyle saw the one who was leaving them. He was sitting by his campfire at dusk, which was something he did every evening, and a figure stepped out of the tree line about 30 yards from his cabin. It was enormous, at least 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, and it was carrying something in its hands, a package of bark that it set down carefully at the edge of the cleared ground. Then it straightened and looked directly at Lyle across the firelight, and Lyle looked back, and the two of them held each other's gaze for maybe 10 seconds. Then the figure turned and walked back into the trees with a silence that Lyle said was inhuman in the literal sense, because no human being that size could move through dense brush without making a sound, and this thing made none. Lyle was not frightened. Cecil said this very precisely. He said Lyle told him that seeing the Omaha for the first time was the single most peaceful experience of his life since coming home from Vietnam. He said the figure radiated an assurance that bypassed language, a pressure he could feel in his chest and his stomach, a physical sensation of safety that he had not experienced since before the war. He said it was as if the thing in the trees was telling him, without words, without gesture, through some channel that went straight past his conscious mind and into whatever part of him still remembered what safe felt like, that he was not a threat and he was not threatened, and he could stop standing watch. I asked Cecil why the Omaha had chosen Lyle. Cecil said Lyle had been chosen because Lyle had done something that almost no modern human being achieves. He had become truly still, not as a technique, not as a practice, not as a spiritual discipline, as a survival mechanism. Years of solitude in those mountains had accomplished what no therapy, no medication, no human intervention had been able to do. It had quieted the war inside him to the point where the Omaha could recognize him as something other than a source of noise. They could see him the way they saw the deer and the bear and the trees, as a living thing that belonged in the forest. And once they saw him that way, they treated him accordingly. They fed him, they watched over him, they included him in their own way, in the community of beings that inhabited that drainage. Cecil said Lyle lived on that property until 2001, when his health finally forced him to come down to the VA hospital in Eureka. He had been in the woods for 28 years. During that time, he had regular contact with at least 3 individual Omaha, a mature male who was the original visitor, a younger female who began appearing in the mid-'80s, and a juvenile who appeared in the early 90s and who Lyle believed was their offspring. He said the juvenile was curious about him in a way the adults were not. It would come closer sometimes to within 15 feet and watch him work in his garden or split wood or smoke fish, studying his hands and his tools with an intensity that Lyle described as hungry, not for the tools themselves, for the understanding of how they worked. He said the juvenile would sometimes mimic his motions, picking up a stick and holding it the way Lyle held his axe handle, bringing it down against a log with a force that split the log clean through in a single stroke, something that took Lyle 3 or 4 blows. Then it would look at Lyle as if to say, that was too easy, and drop the stick and move on to studying something else. Cecil told me these stories over a period of years, with long gaps between that tested my patience and measured my readiness. He told me about a woman named Clarice Nelson, a Hupa elder who had been a keeper before Cecil, who said the Omaha would sometimes appear at the edge of ceremonies watching from the timber, visible only to the participants who were in the deepest state of ceremonial focus. He told me about a Forest Service fire lookout stationed on Horse Mountain in the 1950s who made detailed sketches of an Omaha family group he observed through his binoculars over the course of 2 fire seasons, sketches that Cecil said were locked in a tribal archive and would never be made public. He told me about a Karuk fisherman on the Klamath who had a 30-year relationship with an individual Omaha that came to the same spot on the river every autumn during the salmon run and watched the fisherman work his nets. Every story had the same thread: grief, solitude, ceremonial focus, the slow erosion of years in the woods. The path didn't matter. The destination was the same. They became legible to the Omaha, safe to approach, visible in a way that most people are not. In the summer of 2003, Cecil turned 73. His health was beginning to decline. He had arthritis in both knees and a cough that wouldn't go away, and Bernice was after him to see a doctor in Eureka, which he resisted with the stubbornness of a man who had spent his entire life trusting the forest more than he trusted institutions. We were having fewer of our porch evenings because the drive from Willow Creek to Hupa was harder for me to make after a full day in the field, and I was 56 and feeling my own years in my back and my knees. One evening in August, Cecil called me at home and said he wanted to show me something. He said I should bring a sleeping bag and enough food for 2 days and meet him at a trailhead on the reservation at dawn. He wouldn't say what it was about. Pearl gave me the look she gave me whenever Cecil summoned me into the woods, the look that said she knew I would go regardless of what she thought, and she was right. I met Cecil at the trailhead at 5:30 in the morning. He was carrying a pack that looked too heavy for a 73-year-old man with bad knees, but he waved away my offer to take some of the weight. We hiked for about 6 hours, uphill the entire way, following trails that were not on any map I had seen, through forest that got progressively older and denser the higher we climbed. By noon, we were in old growth so thick that the canopy blocked out most of the sky, and the light on the forest floor had that green underwater quality that you only get in truly ancient timber. The air smelled of decomposing needles and moss, and the faint sweetness of mushroom, and underneath it, barely detectable, that musk, that familiar, complex, earthy musk that I had first smelled in a branch structure 30 years earlier. Cecil stopped in a small clearing beside a seep that fed a trickle of water down a mossy channel between two massive fir trunks. He dropped his pack and sat on a log and looked at me, and his expression held a look I had never seen from him. The look of a man who has decided to entrust someone with the most important thing he possesses. He said he was getting old. His knees were bad and his lungs were going, and he didn't know how many more times he could make this walk. The keeper role needed to pass to someone, and the person it needed to pass to was not Hupa. He said the Omaha had been watching me for 30 years. They had been aware of me since my first summer in the Six Rivers, when I found that structure above Mill Creek and stood in front of it quietly for a long time instead of tearing it apart or calling someone on the radio. They had been the ones calling across the canyon that night in 1974, and the second voice, the one that answered from the far ridge, had positioned itself so that I was between them, not to trap me, to observe me, to see what I would do when I was surrounded by something I couldn't explain. He said I had passed, I had sat still, I had listened, I had not panicked, had not fled, had not reached for a weapon or a radio. I had done what the quiet ones always do. I had been present, and the Omaha had noted it, and they had been tracking me ever since, adjusting their movements around my survey routes, appearing in the margins of my fieldwork in ways I had probably sensed but not consciously registered. The feeling I had carried for years, the feeling that the forest was watching me, was not metaphorical. It was literal. They had been watching. They had been deciding. And they had decided. Cecil said the word he used in Hupa for what had happened was something I cannot reproduce, but he translated it loosely as recognized by the tall ones. He said it was the prerequisite for the keeper role. It could not be conferred by the tribal council or earned through study. It had to come from the Omaha themselves. They had to recognize you, and they had recognized me. I sat on that log in that clearing and felt something move through me that was not an emotion I had a name for. It was not pride. It was not fear. It was not gratitude exactly, though it contained gratitude. It was the feeling of having been seen, truly seen, by something so much older and so much more perceptive than myself, that being seen by it felt like being seen for the first time. Cecil said we would wait until dark. I asked him what would happen. He said he didn't know exactly. He said the Omaha did what they did on their own terms and their own schedule, and the keeper's job was not to summon them, but to be available when they chose to come. So we waited. We ate. We drank water from the seep. We talked a little about practical things, about the timber sale the tribe was planning for the following year, about Pearl's garden, about Bernice's insistence that Cecil see a pulmonologist. As the afternoon wore on, Cecil became quieter and I followed his lead, and by the time the light began to fail, we were sitting in complete silence, shoulder to shoulder on the log, watching the shadows deepen between the trunks of trees that had been standing since before the United States existed. The forest changed around us as darkness fell, not dramatically, subtly. The bird sounds shifted from daytime species to nighttime species. The temperature dropped. The smell of the forest intensified, the way all smells intensify in cool air, and underneath the fir and the moss and the earth, that musk grew stronger. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat. I forced myself to slow my breathing. I thought about what Cecil had taught me about quietness, and I tried to let go of everything that was not the present moment. the survey I needed to finish next week, the truck payment that was coming due, the argument I'd had with Pearl about replacing the water heater. I let all of it go, piece by piece, the way you let go of objects when you're treading water and you realize the weight is pulling you down. I dropped everything until there was nothing left but the sound of the forest and the feel of the bark under my hands and the smell of the air and Cecil's steady breathing beside me. I don't know how long we sat like that. It could have been an hour. It could have been 3. At some point, the silence acquired a quality that I can only describe as intentional. The normal background sounds of the forest didn't stop exactly, but they receded, as if the volume knob had been turned down by a hand that was not mine. The space around us became very still, very focused, and I felt a pressure, not physical pressure, but attentional pressure, the sensation of being observed by something that was giving me its full, undivided concentration. Cecil put his hand on my arm, not gripping, just resting, a gesture that meant, "Be still, I know, it's here." I heard it before I saw it, not a vocalization this time. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, widely spaced footsteps, moving through the timber to our left, maybe 40 yards away. Each step had a weight to it that I could feel in the ground through the soles of my boots. Whatever was walking toward us was massive. The footsteps stopped. There was a pause that lasted maybe 30 seconds, during which I became acutely aware of the sound of my own breathing and made a conscious effort to quiet it further. Then the footsteps resumed, closer now, maybe 25 yards, moving in an arc around the clearing rather than directly toward us. It was circling, assessing, deciding. Then it stepped into the clearing. I saw it in the gray light of a half moon that was filtering through gaps in the canopy, and what I saw was nothing like the gift shop statues on the main street of Willow Creek, and nothing like the blurry photographs in the Bigfoot Museum, and nothing like anything I had imagined in 30 years of hearing Cecil's stories and finding structures and listening to vocalizations across dark canyons. It was tall, taller than me, and I am 6'1". Cecil later estimated it at just over 7 feet, based on a reference mark he knew on a nearby tree. It was broad in a way that made the word broad feel insufficient, shoulders that must have been 3 feet across, a chest like a barrel, arms that hung slightly longer than a human's arms would hang, with hands that seemed too large even for its frame. It was covered in hair that in the moonlight appeared dark brown, almost black except on the chest and the insides of the arms, where it was lighter. Its face was visible as a shape more than a collection of features, but I could see the brow, heavy and prominent, the nose flat and wide, the mouth, which was closed in a line that looked, and I realize how subjective this is, but I am telling you what I saw, patient. It looked patient, the way a person looks when they are waiting for someone to understand something that does not require words. It stood at the edge of the clearing, maybe 15 yards from where Cecil and I sat on our log, and it looked at us, not at the clearing, not at the forest around us, at me. I felt its attention the way you feel sunlight on your skin, a physical warmth that had direction and source. It was examining me with a thoroughness that went beyond eyesight. I had the overwhelming sense that it was reading me the way Cecil had described, not my appearance, not my posture, not even my scent, but something deeper, my state, my internal condition, the texture of my silence. I do not know how long it stood there, long enough for my sense of time to dissolve entirely, which is something that happens when every faculty you possess is engaged in a single act of attention. I was looking at it, and it was looking at me, and the forest was holding its breath around both of us. And in that suspension, in that absolute mutual presence, I understood what Cecil had been trying to teach me for 20 years. The Omaha do not hide. They are always there. They have always been there. in the drainages and the ridgelines and the old growth and the deep timber, moving through a world that overlaps with ours in every direction except one. We cannot see them because we are not paying the right kind of attention. We are paying human attention, fractured and anxious and loud. You have to be still enough, quiet enough, present enough to perceive what has been there all along. And when you are, they don't appear. They were never gone. You simply become capable of seeing what was always in front of you. The Omaha turned its head slightly, looking from me to Cecil and back. Then it did something that dismantled the last wall of separation between my understanding of the world and the reality that Cecil had been slowly, patiently, over the course of 2 decades, preparing me to receive. It took a step forward, not toward the clearing, toward me. One single step, maybe 2 feet of ground covered, and with that step it crossed a line that I understood instinctively was significant. It was closing the distance by choice. It was acknowledging me. It was saying, in the only language it had, which was the language of presence and proximity and chosen movement. Yes, I see you too. You are quiet enough. You are ready. It held my gaze for a few more seconds, and then it turned and walked back into the trees, each step silent despite its size, each stride covering ground that would have taken me 2 or 3 paces, and within moments it was gone. Not hidden, not fled, simply reabsorbed into the forest that it had never really left. Cecil's hand was still on my arm. I realized I was trembling not from cold or fear, but from the sheer physiological overwhelm of what had just happened. Cecil squeezed my arm once and let go, and when I looked at him, the old man was smiling, not a wide smile. A small, quiet smile of a man who has just watched something he hoped for actually happen. He said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Now you understand. Cecil Ferris died in the spring of 2006, lung cancer, which they found too late because he had waited too long to see the doctor in Eureka, just as Bernice had feared. I drove to the hospital in Eureka and sat with him for 3 days. He was lucid until the last few hours, and in those final lucid conversations, he told me things I will not repeat here because they were given to me as a keeper and not as a storyteller, and I will honor that distinction as long as I live. But one thing he said I will share because I believe he would want me to. He said the Omaha were declining, not rapidly, not catastrophically, but slowly, the way a glacier recedes, imperceptibly on any single day, but unmistakably over a lifetime. The keepers had been tracking population numbers in the Trinity River drainage for generations, and the trend was downward. Cecil estimated there were fewer than 40 individuals in the area his family had monitored, down from what his grandfather's records suggested had been over 100 at the turn of the century. The causes were the same causes that threaten every wild species in every wild place on Earth. Habitat loss, fragmentation, roads that cut migration corridors, logging that removed the old growth they depended on for shelter and food, climate changes that shifted the availability of salmon and acorns and berries, and something else, something Cecil called the thinning, which was his term for what happened when a species capable of perception and intelligence and emotional depth was forced into an ever-shrinking range. They became cautious beyond what survival required. They withdrew from the edges of their territory and compressed into the deep core. They stopped appearing at the boundary between their world and ours, not because they chose to, but because the cost of being seen had grown too high. The world that had once been shared had become a world that they could only safely inhabit in its most inaccessible fragments. He asked me to continue, to walk the routes, to maintain the exchange points, to read the signs and report to the tribal council, and he asked me specifically to tell people, not everyone, Not the media, not the researchers who occasionally came through Willow Creek with their thermal cameras and their recording equipment and their urgent need to prove something. Those people, he said, were too loud. They would scare the Omaha deeper into the timber and accomplish nothing. He asked me to tell the quiet ones, the people who already suspected, the people who had had their own experiences and dismissed them, the people who had spent time alone in the woods and felt the presence of something they couldn't name. Tell them, he said, that what they felt was real. Tell them that the Omaha are there. Tell them that the Omaha are watching. And tell them that the Omaha are choosing every day who gets to see them, and the choice is based on something deeper than luck or location. It is based on who you are when nobody is performing, who you are in your quietest, most undefended moment. That is what the Omaha see. And if what they see is still enough, open enough, present enough, they will come forward. They always have. I have been the keeper for 20 years now. I am 78 years old. My knees are worse than Cecil's ever were, and the hike to the clearing where I first saw the Omaha takes me 2 days now instead of 1. Pearl drives me to the trailhead and picks me up 3 days later, and she has never once asked me what I do up there, and I have never once volunteered. It is the one part of my life that I carry alone, and she has accepted it with a grace that I do not think I deserve. I have maintained the routes, I have read the signs, I have reported to the council, and I have continued to see them. Not on every trip, not on most trips, but often enough that the relationship Cecil described, the managed, mutual, centuries-old relationship between the keepers and the Omaha, has remained intact on my watch. I have seen individuals I recognize from decades of observation. I have seen juveniles born and grown. I have heard vocalizations that communicate things I still don't fully understand but recognize well enough to respond to. I have stood in clearings in the dark and felt that pressure, that intentional focus, and known that I was being read, and I have tried every time to be worthy of what they were looking for. I have also seen the decline that Cecil warned me about. The signs are less frequent now than they were 20 years ago. The exchange points that once produced clear evidence of activity every few weeks sometimes go months with nothing. The vocalizations are rarer. The population has contracted further into the deep core of the wilderness, the highest ridges, the most inaccessible drainages, the places where no road goes and no trail is maintained, and the forest is as close to untouched as any forest in California can be in the 21st century. They are still there. I know they are still there because I still see them, still hear them, still find the evidence of their passage. But the buffer between their world and ours has grown thinner, and the thinning that Cecil described has accelerated in ways that frighten me. The tribal council knows. They have adjusted their land management accordingly, setting aside additional areas as cultural reserves where no logging is permitted, rerouting planned roads, maintaining buffer zones that appear on official maps as wildlife corridors but serve a purpose that no official map acknowledges. The Hupa have been protecting the Omaha for longer than any government has existed on this continent, and they will continue to protect them long after I am gone. The keeper role will pass to someone else. Cecil told me who, and that person is being prepared, and the chain will not break. But Cecil's last instruction was to tell people, and I have waited a long time to honor it. I am not telling you this to convince you that Bigfoot exists. If you need convincing, you are probably not the person Cecil meant me to tell. I am telling you this because somewhere out there listening to this is a person who has been in the woods and felt something they couldn't explain. A presence, a watching. A moment when the forest became very still and very focused, and something in the back of their mind said, "You are not alone here," and they dismissed it. because what else could they do? I am telling you that what you felt was real. You were not imagining it. You were not projecting. You were being observed by something that has been observing humans for longer than recorded history, something that knows us better than we know ourselves, something that has been deciding for millennia which of us can be trusted to see what they really are. The Omaha do not hide from us. They choose who gets to see them, and the quality they are looking for is the one quality that the modern world is most hostile to: stillness, presence, the willingness to stop talking, stop performing, stop generating the endless internal noise that we have come to mistake for consciousness itself. The Omaha live in the gaps between our thoughts, in the silence beneath our chatter, in the present moment that we are almost never actually inhabiting. When you get quiet enough, truly quiet, they are right there. They have always been right there. You just have to stop being so loud that you drown them out. Cecil taught me that. It took him 20 years. It took me 30 more to understand it fully. And now I am telling you, because a Hupa elder who loved the forest and the things that lived in it asked me to, and because I am old enough now to know that the most important truths are the ones that take the longest to speak and the quietest voice to deliver. The Omaha are in the mountains. They are in the old growth. They are in the canyons and the drainages and the ridgelines and the clearings where the moonlight falls through gaps in the canopy. They are watching. They are choosing. And they are waiting with a patience that shames every human virtue for us to become quiet enough to see them. I walk those trails every season. I leave dried salmon at the exchange points. I read the signs, and sometimes in the gray light before dawn or the deep blue of a mountain dusk, I see a figure at the edge of the timber, still and watchful, and I feel that warmth, that focus, that ancient recognition pass between us like a current through water. And I stand still, the way Cecil taught me, the way 30 years of solitude in the 6 rivers taught me, and I let myself be seen, not as a surveyor, not as a keeper, not as a white man in Hupa country, as a quiet thing in the woods, as a soul with the noise turned down, as a person who has finally, after a lifetime of learning, stopped being too loud to love. That is what Cecil Ferris gave me, not proof, not evidence, not a theory or a classification or a biological sample. He gave me a way of being in the world that allowed the world to show me what it had been hiding in plain sight. He gave me quietness, and in the quietness, the Omaha came forward, and they have never left.